Hello students. So now that you know what is glycolytic pathway or glycolysis, after which you know that glycolytic pathway gives rise to 2-pyruvic acid as the resultant, right? So what is the fate of pyruvic acid? That is what we are going to learn today. So for fate of pyruvic acid, you know that respiration can be of two types, aerobic and anaerobic. In case it is aerobic respiration, the consequence that the pyruvic acid will face, that will be different, and in case it is aerobic respiration, the consequence will be the different. Okay, it will be different. Now for pyruvic acid, if in case it enters anaerobic respiration, then it will have two different fates. Okay, it may undergo alcohol fermentation, or else it might enter lactic acid fermentation. So in short, in case of anaerobic respiration, when pyruvic acid is formed by glycolysis, that pyruvic acid will enter fermentative pathway or fermentation. In case of certain organisms, it will undergo alcohol fermentation, or else in certain organisms, it will undergo lactic acid fermentation. Okay. But in case of aerobic respiration, there is only one fate that the pyruvic acid will face, and that is Krebs cycle. Okay, for aerobes or aerobic organisms, always the pyruvic acid formed will enter Krebs cycle. Fine. Now, let us discuss the fermentative pathway in details. Now, as you know, fermentation can be of two types. First of all, the fermentation pathway was observed for the first time by Gay-Lussac, and after that, we eventually observed that there are two types of fermentation that can occur. One is alcohol fermentation. In alcohol fermentation, there are two types of or two steps that are involved, and also two products. Okay, completely in the absence of oxygen, alcohol fermentation will take place. Now in alcohol fermentation, pyruvic acid, that is CH3COCOOH, that is the chemical formula of pyruvic acid. So for pyruvic acid, when it enters the alcohol fermentation, in the first step by the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase, it undergoes a step to form two molecules of acetaldehyde and of course two molecules of carbon dioxide. Okay, this carbon dioxide will be released. Fine. In the second step, the acetaldehyde that has been formed, it will undergo a dehydrogenation step. Fine. It will again undergo a dehydrogenation step in which NADH plus H plus will be involved, which will be converted into ethanol, C2H5OH, that is ethanol, and NAD plus will be regenerated. Okay, so the reducing agent NADH will be reoxidized to form NAD plus in this step. So finally, after alcohol fermentation is it is completed, we have two products that has been obtained. One is carbon dioxide in the first step, and in the second step we are going to have alcohol. Okay, and this type of fermentation is of course going to be observed in yeast, the unicellular fungi. In yeast, naturally after glycolysis or glycolytic pathway, the pyruvic acid formed will be entering alcohol fermentation, and it will be converted into acetaldehyde and it will be converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. Okay. So now do remember, alcohol fermentation here does not involve the presence of oxygen at all. This entire process occurs without oxygen involved. Okay. Now, coming to the lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation involves only one step, in which pyruvic acid that has been formed by glycolysis under the enzyme lactate dehydrogenase and certain coenzymes like flavin mononucleotide, FMN and ZN2+, it will be converted into lactic acid. That means in case of lactic acid fermentation, the pyruvic acid is converted into only one product. There are no two products, unlike the alcohol fermentation that is observed here. Okay, because lactic acid fermentation would only give rise to one product, we can also call such pathway to be homofermentative pathway. Do remember this, it's a very, very important thing for you to remember, homofermentative pathway, because it gives rise to a single product. Okay. Now, Of course, lactic acid fermentation can be observed naturally in lactobacillus or lactic acid bacteria, but also during vigorous exercise, also lactic acid fermentation can be observed in human muscles. Okay, if you do vigorous exercise, you might face certain kind of muscle pain or cramps the next day, right? That is because of accumulation of lactic acid. Okay, so naturally lactic acid fermentation occurs in lactobacillus bacteria, but also in case of sometimes when there is vigorous exercise done, the body's demand for oxygen is more but the supply is less. At that time in the muscles, lactic acid fermentation would occur. Okay, understood this? Now for the most important thing, okay, for the most important thing here is that fermentation, you are seeing, it can occur naturally in yeast or it can occur naturally in lactobacillus. But why is fermentation occurring? See, fermentation is otherwise, if you look at it properly, you will find that it is a harmful process because it is not giving rise to any energy. It is not breaking down the glucose further. It is not doing anything. Rather, it is producing harmful or toxic substances like acid or alcohol. Right? Both of them are toxic to the cell which is producing it. So why is fermentation occurring in the first place? Why is fermentation taking place where fermentation is not producing any energy? It is not giving rise to further breakdown of the pyruvic acid. Rather, it is producing certain byproducts which are toxic in nature. Then what is the need for fermentation? The need for fermentation is this: the NADH being reoxidized to NAD+. In both the fermentation, this would take place. In lactic acid fermentation also and also in alcohol fermentation, you will find that the NADH that was formed in glycolytic pathway, in the dehydrogenation step of the glycolytic pathway, NADH was formed, right? So this NADH has to be further reoxidized to NAD+. Why? Because only then this NAD+ can be again used, okay, during glycolytic pathway. It can be further recycled to be used in the glycolytic pathway. If NADH remains as such, in that case there will be no NAD+, or there will be no reducing agent available for glycolytic pathway to continue. So that glycolytic pathway can continue, the NADH that has been formed in glycolysis has to be reoxidized to NAD+ every time fermentation occurs. So this is the main concept behind fermentation that you should know, that even after fermentation is not doing any benefit to the cell, it is not, rather it is producing toxic substances. What is the need for fermentation? The need for fermentation is only to convert the NADH into NAD+ so that this can be again used during glycolytic pathway and glycolysis can occur continuously. Alright. Now for the main another important thing, that how much of energy is produced in organisms which do not undergo aerobic respiration, or how much of total energy is being produced by an anaerobe, okay, by the anaerobic organism. The answer to the question is 2 ATP, because you properly know that glycolysis or glycolytic pathway produces total 4 ATP, isn't it? In the payoff phase of glycolysis, 4 ATP are produced. Right? Out of that, 2 are already been used in the activation phase of glycolysis. So, net gain of ATP is only 2. And fermentation is not producing any ATP at all. So, in that case, for anaerobic organism, the total amount of energy that is produced by their respiration is only 2 ATP. And of course, you know, or you would agree that 2 ATP is not at all going to be sufficient for maintaining a higher life form, for maintaining a complex life form, right? That's why anaerobic respiration is mostly confined to microbial or simpler organisms like bacteria or unicellular organisms, okay? Anaerobic respiration you will be only finding in case of unicellular organisms or simpler organisms. Most of higher organisms, that's why, are aerobes, because aerobic respiration will produce a much more larger amount of ATP. Alright, I hope all of you are clear about this part. In the next class, we are going to discuss Krebs cycle.